Okay, welcome to the next video in the series Defending the Truthfulness of the Bible. We are in the section Defending the Old Testament, and we just finished the video series on Old Testament types, which argued for design in the Old Testament based on the number of people, places, and events that foreshadowed in a physical manner what Christ would one day accomplish spiritually. In this video, I will defend the reliability of the Old Testament by looking at the scientific knowledge that the ancient Israelite culture had that far exceeded their time, as recorded in the Old Testament. The purpose of this video will be to show that the ancient Israelite culture possessed scientific knowledge that could only have been given to them by a higher power. The key point in understanding this is that the Israelites did not understand the knowledge they possessed. If they did, they would most certainly have used it to develop a lifestyle that more closely resembles like that of a modern culture, but they didn't. This knowledge, without understanding, shows that they were almost certainly not the source of the information they possessed, for if they were the source, then they would have understood it. If you wish to see the argument that I just laid out in deductive format, perhaps to check if it is watertight, here it is. But this argument speaks the language of our modern culture. Christianity is often attacked because it is thought that it is anti-science, that we have to choose between faith in God and science. But here I will show that God gave the Israelites scientific knowledge that we are only recently confirming the truth of. To show this, I selected what I thought were the strongest examples of scientific knowledge in the Old Testament. In an effort to steel man my position, I excluded many of the verses that are commonly offered in arguments like this, only taking the ones that are the most difficult to argue with. Before we begin, note that some might ask, well, is it possible that the Israelites deduced their scientific knowledge as opposed to having it given to them? For example, we will talk about how Job, among other books, speaks of the water cycle, which describes how water evaporates, condenses in the clouds, and falls back to earth. But perhaps the Israelites could have deduced that from watching steam from a pot form condensate, or from watching fog condense on the leaves into droplets, thinking that the same thing happens on a much larger scale in the clouds. I have a few answers to this. Firstly, if the Israelites were ultimately the source of their knowledge of the water cycle, then why didn't they seem to understand it? In the instances we will look at, they will use very simple words to convey these complex scientific truths, as someone who is uneducated in the subject would use. That is, they don't describe it in exact detail like someone who discovered it themselves would. Furthermore, they did not use their knowledge to their own advantage. This is surprising, for if they were smart enough to figure out the water cycle, why didn't they use their deductive capacities and their newfound knowledge to make even more advanced discoveries, perhaps even starting to predict the weather in the long run? And if their knowledge of germ theory, as the Levitical law implies, was ultimately deduced by them, then why didn't they start developing more advanced treatments for infectious diseases? As it is, the fact that they had knowledge but did not understand it or use it to their own advantage is evidence that it came from an outside source. And I could add that many of the parts of the Old Testament that contained the health benefits or the scientific knowledge the Israelites later abandoned. An example is honoring the Sabbath, as we will see. If they truly understood the science behind things like that, like we do, then surely they would not have abandoned them. Or at the least, they would have kept them in a superficial manner so as to still get the benefits of them instead of completely apostatizing like they did. Secondly, we must adjust for history here. It is easy for us who have the benefit of hindsight, who live after the science has been discovered, to say, well, why didn't we think of that earlier? Let's consider Albert Einstein's thought experiment that demonstrated his theory of relativity. I won't explain it here, but suffice it to say that it is pretty simple once we get it. And yet, no one discovered relativity until Einstein, in spite of its simplicity. One could say the same of Gregor Mendel's discovery of genetics by crossing his pea plants. Why didn't someone discover this earlier? But no one did, because from their point of view, with the knowledge they had, deducing such a thing would have been very difficult. So let's not be too optimistic here about the Israelites' capacity to deduce something like the water cycle. In spite of how simple it seems to us, it took people until the 1600s to formally discover it. Likewise, knowledge of germs comes easily to us, and yet they weren't discovered by human effort until the 1860s. If this knowledge was so obvious, then why did it take so long to discover, by human deduction, that is? It is important for us to put ourselves in the shoes of an ancient culture who did not have access to the scientific knowledge that we have access to now. This was before the scientific method had been put into official use, and much of their time was spent surviving, not thinking about abstract concepts. That makes the fact that the Israelites had the knowledge they did all the more astounding. Thirdly, we will see that some of the knowledge that the Israelites possessed, such as the fact that the earth hangs on nothing or that its crust had foundations in the mantle, could not have been deduced by them no matter how many Einsteins they had, given their limited technological capacities. Also, before we begin, note that I will be quoting extensively from the Levitical law contained in the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. I do not want to give the impression that the law is binding on Christians today, because in my opinion, it is not. Just because I am mining something for its scientific value does not mean that we should follow it. This is consistent with what Paul says in Ephesians 2:15, where he is talking about Christ's work. He says, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. So the law in its entirety has been abolished. It has been replaced with something better. Sure, Christians are to do some of the things that are in the law, but they are not to do them because they are in the law. They do them because they are repeated in the New Testament. We would expect some things to be repeated because they have their author in common, just as we would expect the works, Great Expectations and A Tale of Two Cities to have some things in common because they were both written by Charles Dickens. I think the Bible is pretty clear that the law was only temporary and was done away with once Christ completed his work. It was replaced with something better. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 5:17-18 that not one jot or tittle will pass away from the law until all has been fulfilled. He simply hadn't fulfilled it yet. Now that that is clarified, let's dive into the Levitical law, where I will present a cumulative case that the Israelites were given knowledge of health and wellness that has only recently been confirmed by modern science. Before we begin, note that this part of the video heavily relies on a cumulative case. That is, none of the examples from the Levitical law in isolation are enough to definitively show inspiration. However, when combined, I think that they speak more strongly. So the first part of the Levitical law that we will cover is the commandment to not ingest blood. Genesis 9:4 says, "But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." And Leviticus 17:12-14 says, "Therefore I have said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood. Anyone also of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn among them, who takes in hunting any beast or bird that may be eaten, shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For the life of every creature is its blood is its life." This commandment is repeated in Deuteronomy 12:23 and Deuteronomy 15:23 and in Ezekiel 33:25. The health benefits of this have been corroborated by modern science in 2 ways. The first is the statement that an animal's life is in its blood. Some ancient cultures used to think that the life of an organism was in its heart or its brain, but not in its blood. As much as I would love to give you all the biochemical details of why oxygen is needed to keep us alive, suffice it to say that in a nutshell, the life of an organism is in its blood because blood delivers oxygen to our tissues, without which we die. Is it a coincidence that the Old Testament law just happens to say this? Some might say that it is common sense that the life of an animal is in its blood. Anyone, even those in an ancient culture, could see that if an animal bleeds out, it will die. Fair enough, But let me continue in building my cumulative case for my conclusion. The Israelites were told not to ingest blood. We know that there are many blood-borne diseases, such as syphilis, HIV, or hepatitis, that can be spread through blood, of which ingesting it would be a mechanism. And there are pathogens that are specific to certain species that are found in their blood. While it is true that we have modern health codes that tell us how to safely prepare a rarely cooked steak, ancient cultures did not have this. In fact, many of the laws were given to the Israelites in order to separate them from the surrounding cultures, to keep them holy. So the very fact that this law was given is evidence that it was not practiced in the surrounding cultures and was therefore not intuitive. And that goes for most of the commands in the Levitical law. In this case, I think that God was saving his people from many potential diseases, and the fact that blood could indeed carry pathogens was confirmed at the earliest by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s when he founded germ theory. But let me speak to some fellow Christians who would object to my methods on the grounds that health and wellness was not the primary purpose of God's law, but rather to show the Israelite people how to conduct themselves in a holy manner. I am aware of this. However, we nevertheless see a pattern in its commands, which is that they consistently result in health benefits. This pattern needs explaining, just like the pattern in this picture would need explaining. We would say that a designer is needed in both cases, and the simplest explanation is that whoever designed them intended for them to have that effect. One might say, well, the consistent health benefits that are correlated with following God's commands are just part of the natural order. No explanation needed. But who designed the natural order to be that way? It's God, right? And we would say that other aspects of the natural order, like the laws of gravity or of mathematics, were intended to be that way by God. Why would the health benefits in the Levitical law be any different? That pattern, even if it is part of the natural order, needs explaining. So, I think that God's intent is implied through the consistent health benefits we see. I am not putting words in his mouth. But next, we have the command to avoid ingesting fat. Leviticus 3:16 says, "All fat is the Lord's." And Exodus 29:13 says, "And you shall take all the fat that covers the entrails, and the long lobe of the liver, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them, and burn them on the altar." We know now that the ingestion of excessive amounts of fat, especially when it is combined with a lack of physical exercise, is a risk factor for diseases such as atherosclerosis, which is a fatty buildup of plaque in one's arteries that eventually leads to their hardening, and atherosclerosis is a major risk factor for myocardial infarctions, otherwise known as heart attacks, as well as obesity, stroke, and hypertension. And this knowledge is not intuitive. To an ancient culture that didn't know about the health risks with this, they most likely would have eaten fat because it tastes awesome. For what would you rather eat? An extremely lean steak that you have to chew for 5 minutes, or a lard-infused steak that slides down your throat like butter? So this command is not likely to be something that they would have done on their own. This is why the high priest Eli's sons would take the best portions of the sacrifice, referring to the fatty part, for themselves, dishonoring God in the process. Next, we have the Old Testament guidelines on clean and unclean animals. Now, to be clear, unclean refers to ceremonial and not moral uncleanness. Of course, if one chose to eat an unclean animal, it would be morally wrong for them to do so because God commanded them not to, but there is nothing inherently wrong about eating an unclean animal. Among the animals in the Old Testament law that I was familiar with, the following trend was revealed. Generally speaking, the Israelites were encouraged to eat herbivores, things that eat only plants, and they were generally discouraged from eating things that eat meat or eat dead things. So they were not to eat predators, generally speaking, and they were not to eat scavengers, such as the carrion vulture. To modern readers, this is obvious because of a carrion vulture's diet. But this would not have been the case for an ancient audience. Remember, germ theory wasn't confirmed until the 1860s by Louis Pasteur. Similarly, the Israelites were told not to eat things that died of natural causes. We now know that such meat is likely diseased and is contaminated with pathogens, but this would not have been common knowledge among an ancient culture that was not familiar with germ theory. So, we have added one more link to my cumulative case. If there was not intent of the Israelites' health and well-being in the Levitical law, then why do so many of its commands just so happen to benefit their health, with a corresponding lack of commands that harm their health? And if there was intent, how could the Israelites have been the source of it, given that the knowledge conveyed was way beyond their time? One might say, well, some knowledge of health is just common sense. You don't have to understand the human body to know that you shouldn't eat scavengers, and this has a degree of truth, which is why I rely on a cumulative case. But I wouldn't necessarily give ancient cultures the benefit of the doubt. Some things that are intuitive to us weren't always that way. Even in modern cultures, hand washing among physicians wasn't enforced until the 1800s, until which they would go from dissecting a corpse to delivering a baby without washing their hands, or wearing gloves for that matter, resulting in high infant mortality rates. And sterilization of bone saws wasn't enforced in the American Civil War, resulting in high mortality rates among amputees. Well, one might say, well, what about the practices of ancient cultures like the Egyptians and the Greeks that predate the Israelites? These include a relatively advanced medical system with the Egyptians, or cleansing ceremonies and baths with the Greeks. You wouldn't say they're inspired, would you? And yet, their knowledge predates the Israelites. This is yet another reason I am relying on a cumulative case. I do believe that ancient cultures would come up with a few of the points in the Levitical law on their own, but not all of them. For example, the Greeks practiced cleanliness and healthy eating, but did not have the sexual ethics of the Jews, the health benefits of which will be explained later. Or, the Egyptians may have had advanced medical knowledge for their time, but they also thought the heart, not the blood, was the life of a person. And I doubt that they had the sexual ethics of the Jews. I am not an expert in ancient history, so I could be wrong here, so feel free to fact check me on this. At the very least, it shows that the Jews were not primitive and ignorant as many modern-day skeptics seem to imply, and this adds credibility to what they wrote in the Old Testament. But let us continue. Continuing with ceremonial uncleanness, Leviticus 13 delineates how having a skin disease such as leprosy made one unclean. Touching a person with said skin disease could make one unclean even though they were previously clean. Is this referring to moral uncleanness? No, for having a skin disease is not inherently sinful, although it could certainly be a sign of sin. In what sense, then, is one made unclean by a skin disease or by touching someone with a skin disease? I think that given what we know about germ theory and about how leprosy in particular is spread, it is reasonable to say that whatever ultimately gave this command had the Israelites' health in mind. Basically, don't touch people with skin diseases so you don't get what they have. And sometimes this ceremonial uncleanness was a representative of moral uncleanness or sin. That is, by avoiding physical diseases like leprosy at all costs for health reasons, God was teaching the Israelites how rigorously they should seek to avoid the spiritual disease of sin that could infect their soul. Moving on, in Leviticus 5:2, it says that to touch the carcass of an unclean animal makes one unclean. This is further evidence to support my theory that unclean animals were labeled as unclean, at least in part, for health reasons. Again, don't touch dead things may seem intuitive to us, but again, this would probably not have been common knowledge in ancient cultures. Leviticus 15 goes into detail on the uncleanness of and the cleansing ceremonies for a man with an emission of semen and for a woman who had her menstrual discharge. We know now about sexually transmitted diseases and about blood-borne pathogens, but let me go into detail on a particular passage in Leviticus 15 that is consistent with germ theory. Leviticus 15, 4-11 says, "Every bed on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And anyone who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever sits on anything on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And if the one with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And any saddle on which the one with the discharge rides shall be unclean. And whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Anyone whom the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. So the passage says that the bed he sleeps on is unclean. A bed definitely is incapable of sinning, so this refers to ceremonial, not moral uncleanness. But why would the bed be unclean? Because it was in contact with the emission. Likewise, the saddle that he sits on is unclean. It is implied that if this man were to touch something with his forehead or his heel, that would not be unclean. As it is, the saddle is unclean because it came into physical contact with that particular area of the body. The Israelites were told not to touch him. So, don't risk any transmission of this uncleanness to another person. It continues to say that if this man spits on a person, that they are unclean. Now, I don't know what connection there is between reproductive fluids and saliva, but at the very least, we could say that the lawgiver here is making it clear that they do not want any aspect of that person's uncleanness to be spread to others. The passage continues to say that this man was unclean until evening, suggesting that the uncleanness would resolve itself after a given period of time. This would have given the man time to change his clothes and possibly cleanse themselves before coming into contact with others. And lastly, it says if the person has come into contact with anyone without first rinsing his hands, that person is unclean. This is also an ancient example of quarantine. Those labeled unclean were effectively isolated from the rest of the community. Okay, and remember, none of this was discovered officially speaking until Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. The next topic concerns genetic health. Leviticus 18 lays out detailed instructions to the Israelites that basically say, don't be inbred. It tells them to not have relations with people such as close relatives, parents, sister, stepsister, granddaughter, aunt, uncle, or daughter-in-law. And Leviticus 18:3 says, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. And then in verses 24 through 25, it says, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. For by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land has become unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So God was driving out the Canaanite nations because they practiced incest, among other things. So it is not likely that the Israelites avoiding such a practice was a coincidence or something they would have done anyways. This is why when the Israelites rejected their God, one of the chief areas that was compromised was their sexual ethics. This knowledge was not intuitive to them, nor was it intuitive to the Habsburg dynasty in Spain in the 1600s. A picture of one of their members is shown here. But we now know about our genomes and about how recessive alleles can combine during inbreeding, leading to some of the harmful genetic conditions we see today. If you want more detail on that, just look up a Punnett square, a picture of which is shown here. Note that Gregor Mendel did not found the field of genetics until 1865, about 3,200 years after Leviticus was written, and the knowledge that DNA carried our genetic information and that combining recessive alleles could be harmful was not discovered until the 1950s at the earliest. And here the Israelites in 1400 BC are practicing things that are consistent with these discoveries. This concept is related to the flood account in Genesis. Before the flood, people could live to over 900 years old, according to the genealogies in Genesis 5. But after the flood, the lifespans gradually decreased as seen by the genealogy in Genesis 11. Why is this? I think the main reason is that the world's population was reduced to 8 people, and they had to repopulate the world to get what we have today. That is some major incest, although in that specific instance it was not wrong, since they were following God's command to repopulate the earth. But in genetics, this is called the bottleneck effect, where the population is reduced, forcing the gene pool through the neck of a bottle, so to speak. This is evidence that the flood account is at least partially true, for they were consistent with modern science, something that would be unlikely if they were making it up or were otherwise mistaken. But next on the list is circumcision, the process whereby the foreskin of the penis of every Israelite male was removed. This is commanded to take place on day 8 of the baby's life, as seen in Leviticus 12:3, which says, "On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised." This has been associated with certain health benefits, such as a lower risk of urinary tract infections or sexually transmitted infections, as well as decreased rates of cervical and penile cancer. And I think this has to do with the increased cleanliness after circumcision. There are less skin folds and unexposed surface area where the bacteria could collect. It is also said by some that on day 8 of a baby's life is when one of their clotting factors for their blood, vitamin K, is expressed at its highest level in their lifetime, being at about 110% of normal adult levels. And they would say that this was by design. Only God knew that they had to wait 8 days until circumcision so that the baby wouldn't bleed out. The part about vitamin K being expressed at higher levels on day 8 is true. However, there are other factors, such as increased hematocrit, which is the density of red blood cells, that make the blood thicker and able to clot on days prior to day 8, despite having low vitamin K levels. On the other hand, when modern babies are circumcised in hospitals, they are given a dose of vitamin K proactively to help with the bleeding. So I think that the evidence for this point is inconclusive. However, it is safe to say that circumcision has some mild health benefits that the cultures surrounding Israel did not have knowledge of because they did not receive the Mosaic law. This is part of why David derisively called Goliath an uncircumcised Philistine in 1 Samuel 17:26, and Paul says in Ephesians 2:11 that Gentiles, referring to non-Jews, were called, quote, the uncircumcision by Jews, which supports the idea that circumcision was unique to the Jews. Next, we have the 4th commandment of the 10 commandments, which is to rest on the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is seen in Exodus 20:8-11, which says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." There are health benefits to taking intentional rest, which the Israelites were to do every 7 days. This allows the body to reset itself. Today, the benefits of practices such as mindfulness, meditation, and intentional recovery periods are known. There is an Andrew Huberman podcast that I cite here relating to this. But one might say, well, this is intuitive. Everyone knows that you need to take a break every now and then. Well, elsewhere in the Bible, it records that the Israelites violated the Sabbath, treating it as they would treat it any other day. If resting on the Sabbath was just common sense to the Israelites, then why were they just itching to not rest? For it is tempting to work 7 days out of the week instead of 6, when it appears that more money can be made that way. This violation of the Sabbath is not something the biblical authors would have made up, since it was incriminating to their nation and most certainly did not make them popular. In addition to the absence of work, the Sabbath worked in a positive manner by forcing the Israelites to focus on something outside of themselves. The purpose of the Sabbath, according to Exodus, was to remember God's creative work, and that after creating everything in 6 days, that he rested on the 7th day, calling it holy. and studies have shown that people who are statistically the most happy are the ones who find something outside of themselves to focus on. So this would include things like community involvement or being a member of a religion. Focusing inwardly on self does the opposite. This is definitely not intuitive. Our basic nature is to serve ourselves. This is even the case among modern people who consider themselves to be morally superior to ancient cultures like the Israelites. And as we see, the Israelites eventually added a whole bunch of rules to the Sabbath that shifted the focus away from God onto man. So if focusing on something outside of self was intuitive, then why were the Israelites so quick to abandon that? Additional principles of health in the Levitical law include sanitation, as laid out in Deuteronomy 23:12-13, which basically tells the Israelites if they have to poop, bury it outside the camp. This would prevent diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and various bacterial infections. Although I do not know whether this was practiced in other ancient cultures, I doubt that it was, because even in modern times, such as in Paris during the bubonic plague, this was not practiced, which is in part why so many people died. Then we have waste disposal, as seen in Leviticus 4:11-12. It basically told the Israelites to burn what remains of the oxen that was sacrificed, to not let it sit around, and this would prevent many viral and bacterial diseases that could either infect or come from the oxen's remains. And lastly, we have sterilization, seen in Numbers 31:23, which tells the Israelites to pass their instruments through the fire to make them clean. This is commonly practiced in modern laboratories, as bacteria can develop a biofilm that makes them resistant to other methods of cleaning. But the Israelites had knowledge of all these things. This knowledge, of course, was without understanding, demonstrating that it came from an outside source. Again, some of the advances in the Levitical law were practiced by other ancient cultures like the Greeks or Egyptians. However, this argument is a cumulative case. If one objects to what I am saying, then I challenge them to find one ancient culture besides Israel that practiced the scope of things the Israelites practice that are consistent with modern advances in health science. They would also need a corresponding lack of practices that are inconsistent with modern health science. If they can do this, then I would be disproven. But that marks the end of the scientific knowledge in the Levitical law. If whatever authored scripture lacked the scientific knowledge that we have now, one would not expect to see such a consistent pattern of positive health benefits. We will now transition to other verses that do not rely on a cumulative case, that is, they are strong enough to stand on their own. The Bible says that we are made from dust, and that to dust we shall return. Genesis 3:19 says, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Psalm 104:29 says of the animals, "When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust." And Ecclesiastes 3:20 says, "All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return." We now know that the same basic elements that comprise dust are what we are made of. These include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and silicone. One could say that we are dust, just rearranged a little bit on the molecular level. Why? Because the same periodic table gives rise to both. And the Bible says, "To dust you shall return." This could be seen by anyone who saw a dead body decompose, but that wouldn't explain the first part of the statement, that we are made from dust. How could an ancient culture know that? When we put the two parts together, we see that the Bible supports the law of the conservation of matter, which states that matter is neither created nor destroyed, only rearranged. So, God rearranges dust to form man, and when man dies, this process is reversed. The law of the conservation of matter wasn't formalized until the 1780s by the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier, and Dmitri Mendeleev and his counterparts did not put together the periodic table until the 1860s, and yet Genesis was written about 3,200 years before that. Then we have the Bible's record of subterranean oceans, which is implied through verses like Genesis 7:11 that record the onset of Noah's flood. It reads, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened." Now Noah's flood apparently covered the tops of the tallest mountains by at least 10 cubits, which is about 15 feet, and the entire earth was flooded in this way, meaning that an absolutely massive amount of water had to be deposited. Now this cannot be done just through rain, because rain only lays down what evaporates from the surface. So rain can certainly cause local flooding, but not a global one. There needs to be a net input of water. Where did Noah's flood get this? Part of the answer comes from the springs of the great deep quoted in Genesis 7:11. This is also referenced in Job 38:16, where God rhetorically asks Job, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep?" And Proverbs 3:20 says of God, "By his knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew." And Proverbs 8:28 says again of God, "When he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep." And it has only been recently discovered that beneath the earth's crust lies large amounts of water, containing at least the volume of water that is present in our oceans today, if not more. If, theoretically, the crust were to open and that water were to burst forth, then it could flood the entire earth, and eventually it would return to the place it came from. Note that there is a whole theory regarding Noah's flood, about how the subterranean oceans burst forth from what is now called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But to be fair, the Bible does seem to indicate that there was another source of this water, which is the sky above. This is stated in 2 Peter 3:5-6, which says, "The earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished." I think Peter says "these," meaning that the earth was deluged both by the water above it and by the water below it. But I don't think this affects my point, which is that the Bible contains knowledge of the waters below thousands of years before they were officially discovered. One might say, but we have no proof that the, quote, waters above existed. Granted, we also had no proof that the subterranean oceans existed until recently, and yet both Moses and Peter seemed to know about them thousands of years ago. Perhaps if they knew thousands of years beyond their time about the existence of waters below, we should believe Peter when he references the waters above. So the question remains, how could Moses have known that a source of water large enough to at least partially flood the earth existed beneath the earth's surface? Maybe Noah's flood was common knowledge to ancient cultures, and they all knew where the water came from. But saying this would force one to admit that Noah's flood really happened. Next, we have the concept of Pangaea, the supercontinent in primordial earth that scientists say all the current continents came from. Genesis 1:9 says, "And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry lands appear. And it was so." Now, if all the water is gathered into one place, and what isn't water is land, then we can also know that all the land was gathered to one place, meaning there weren't 7 continents. Moses was writing this around 1400 BC, which was well after Pangaea had split by secular dating methods. Now, there is a theory among some Christians that Noah's flood is what broke up Pangaea. One could say that since this only happened about 1,000 years before Moses' lifetime instead of millions of years, like most scientists say, that maybe Moses had knowledge of Pangaea. But this would again require acknowledging that Noah's flood really happened, which would likely require a younger dating of the earth, which I doubt the skeptic is willing to do. One might object, saying, well, what about the other parts of Genesis that contradict science? Like what about saying the earth is only 6,000 years old, or the need for an intelligent designer that evolution says isn't necessary? You're just cherry-picking the parts of Genesis that seem to agree and ignoring the parts that disagree. Well, as far as the age of the earth goes, I think a good argument can be made for both a young earth or an old earth from the Genesis accounts. In this way, Genesis does not necessarily contradict modern science. As far as the need for a designer goes, I would refer to my series on macroevolution, which gives an argument against macroevolution from biochemistry called Irreducible Complexity, taken from Michael Behe's book titled Darwin's Black Box. Even if Genesis could not be reconciled with modern science, these parts of it would not cancel or negate the parts that are consistent with science. The objection is therefore a red herring or a distraction to an extent. As it is, I think getting even half of these points to be consistent with modern science is impressive, even if the rest of it wasn't consistent. After all, don't we praise the Greeks for having baths that promote modern standards of cleanliness in spite of their sexual practices that promoted poor genetic health? Why would we treat the Hebrews with a different standard? As it is, the theory of continental drift, of which Pangea is the starting point, was not theorized until 1912 by Alfred Wegener. Next, we have the book of Job, which records the suffering and restoration of a man named Job. It is estimated to have been written anywhere from about 950 BC to as far back as 1400 BC, depending on who wrote it. Some think that Job authored it himself. However, this view is not popular. Others think that Moses authored it, which would place its composition around 1400 BC. Others think that Solomon was its author due to its poetic nature and similarity with other things that he wrote, which would place its composition around 950 BC. This means that, at the very least, whatever scientific knowledge we see in the book of Job would have been present around 950 BC at the latest. But if one accepts that the book accurately records the sayings of an actual person named Job, then that pushes the date back to around 2000 BC, which is when Job lived. And I don't think that there is a reasonable basis to assume otherwise, for that means that Solomon or Moses or whoever would have had to insert their scientific knowledge into the mouth of Job and thereby be lying. But this is not likely. But Job 26:7 says, "He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing." Now how could Job have known that the earth hangs on nothing, which we now know to be the case through our knowledge of outer space? This fact was not confirmed until the 20th century, although it was suspected long before this. But still, that demonstrates uncanny knowledge, especially when other ancient cultures came up with theories like the earth is on the back of a giant turtle. And Job continues in verse 10, saying, "He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness." And Proverbs 8:22 says something similar and says, "When he established the heavens, I was there, when he drew a circle on the face of the deep." Job references a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. I think the boundary between light and darkness refers to the horizon, and he says there is a circle on the face of the waters at that boundary. I think that most reasonably refers to the ocean, and Job says it forms a circle. Now how could he have known that the earth was spherical instead of flat? Sure, maybe Job looked out on the ocean one day and saw the mast of a ship appear before the rest of the ship did, and maybe he deduced it that way. But that is asking a lot. This is especially the case when we add the fact that man did not know of Earth's spherical nature until the Greeks figured it out in the 6th century BC. Job was written at least 300 to 400 years before this. The next topic concerns the Bible's knowledge of the water cycle, which refers to the process of water evaporating from the Earth's surface, condensing, and falling back down in the form of precipitation. Job 26:7, or actually 26:8, says, "He binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them." So Job seems to know that clouds are made of water. And Job 36:27 through 28 says, "For he draws up the drops of water, they distill his mist in rain, which the skies pour down." We can combine these verses to yield the following truth, which is that water is drawn up into the clouds, which condenses and falls to the earth as rain. This pretty much sums up the water cycle as we know it, but let's break it down. Let's start with the first part of the water cycle, which is evaporation. Job 36 says that he draws up his water into the clouds. How might God do this? Surely Job didn't think that God draws up water by making it rise from the surface in liquid or solid form. That would be quite a sight. No, he is implying here, although he didn't know it, that this water rises in forms that are not visible, that is, gas, water vapor. The next step of the water cycle is that once this water vapor reaches a high enough altitude where the temperature is colder, it condenses into liquid form. After this, the molecules of water start to conglomerate, forming water droplets. Job 36 records both of these steps, even separating them from one another. It says that God distills his mist into rain. Mist refers to water vapor, and Job is saying that the rain starts out in mist form. Then he says that this mist is distilled. Distilled is a scientific term, and it refers to the collection of water from condensate. Distillation is often used to separate the impurities out of water. The water is heated until it evaporates. The condensate is then collected in some kind of container, leaving the impurities behind. And assuming that the translators translated the Hebrew correctly into distilled, Job says that the same process happens with mist. He then says that this distillation is what forms the rain. We now know that when the water vapor condenses to liquid form, that these microdroplets have to combine to form bigger rain droplets that are heavy enough to fall to the earth. And Job implies this when he says that the mist is distilled into rain, implying that it is not a direct process. Now, how could he have known this? Surely he had not been in a cloud before, and even if he had been, he could not have deduced that that is how rain forms. This is something that only modern scientific knowledge is capable of. But Job also said in chapter 26 that this takes place in the clouds. He binds up the waters in his thick clouds. He then says in chapter 36 that this water falls to the earth as rain. This is incredible, and by the lack of technical terms and precise terminology, we can tell that he does not fully understand the process that he is describing. This means it could only have been given to him by an outside source. Other verses that mention what Job affirms include Psalm 104 verse 3, which says, "He lays the beams of his chambers on the water. He makes his clouds his chariot." I think this is David's way of saying the same thing twice. David is using cloud and waters interchangeably to describe God's majesty. It is clear that David is speaking figuratively here, since God does not have an actual chariot, at least not in Scripture. But that does not negate the fact that he is using cloud and waters interchangeably. Then we have Ecclesiastes 1:7, which says, "All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again." The implications that 1. Water is being taken out of the ocean so that they are never full, and 2. That the streams have a source that feeds them so as to be continually flowing, are both consistent with the modern understanding of the water cycle. Then we have Isaiah 55:10, which says, "For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth," so Isaiah says that the rain and snow return to heaven after they water the earth. How could Isaiah have known this in 700 BC? Next we have what seems to be an understanding of the earth's mantle and of its tectonic plates. Psalm 104, 5-8 says, "He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down." Now David is likely talking about the creation events recorded in Genesis 1, although that is not for certain. Either way, he says two things about the mountains. Firstly, they were initially underwater. the water stood above the mountains. And this likely refers to Genesis 1 verse 2, which says that the earth started out formless and empty, and that it was covered by the great deep. Then David says that the mountains rose, implying that they became visible so that we have what we see today. So the mountains started out beneath the water and somehow rose to where they are above the water. This is consistent with tectonic plate theory, which was formalized by Alfred Wegener in 1912, which states that we lie on massive plates called tectonic plates that slowly move across the Earth's mantle. When these plates collide or grind against each other, they buckle, pushing up mountain ranges from beneath us. And David seems to know of this same process in the 10th century BC. Of course, he does not understand it, or maybe he would have talked about it in more detail and in more technical terms, suggesting that this knowledge was given to him by an outside source. But the second implication is that underwater mountains still exist. If the mountains came from under the sea and are now visible, this implies that they have their foundation in the oceans, and we know this to be true. Do you know what the world's tallest mountain is? That's a trick question. It is not Mount Everest, rather it is Mauna Kea, which is the volcano in Hawaii. It rises about 13,800 feet above sea level, but descends to about 18,000 feet below sea level, making it the world's tallest mountain from base to summit. And David implied that underwater mountains exist through what he wrote in Psalm 104 about 2,800 years before we had submarines and tectonic plate theory. And most of the mountains David would have been familiar with would not have been touching the sea, so I don't think David could have deduced this just by looking at the mountains he was familiar with. But here comes the coolest part. The psalm says that he covered it, referring to the earth, with the water as with a garment. We now know that the water that God used as a garment is the oceans, and if that is what God covered the earth with, then the earth must refer to the earth's crust that lies beneath the oceans, and all of this is apparently laid on the foundations of something even deeper, for God, quote, set the earth on its foundations. What might these foundations be? Well, it was not too long ago, historically speaking, that we discovered the earth has a mantle, which is a layer of molten rock thousands of miles thick that lies beneath the earth's core and the crust. It is on this that the crust of the earth has its foundations. Without it, the earth would implode. How could David have known something like this without supernatural knowledge? Again, he clearly did not understand what it is he was talking about, or he would have used more technical terms and described it in more detail. The fact that David knew this without understanding it implies that his knowledge was given to him from an outside source. The next point comes from the book of Isaiah, which says in 34 verse 4, all the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll. Now Isaiah says that the sky can be rolled up like a scroll, implying that it is made of something. If it was nothing, then how could one roll it up? And if the sky wasn't made of anything, then how could it disappear? We know now that the sky as we see it is actually composed of the Earth's atmosphere, which is partially responsible for its blue color. But this would not have been intuitive to an ancient culture if, theoretically, something like a black hole were to suck away the Earth's atmosphere, then the sky would go black like outer space, and it would appear to roll up and disappear. Regardless of what event could explain this end-time phenomenon, it is clear that Isaiah demonstrated knowledge that we only now have confirmed with modern science. The Bible says something similar about outer space. Isaiah 42:5 says, Thus says God, the Lord who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it. And Isaiah 40 verse 22 says, It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. And it says God stretched out the heavens, and we must ask, what does Isaiah mean by heavens? Well, he is talking about creation as recorded in Genesis 1. There, the heavens are said in verse 1 to be separate from the earth, for in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And later, it says that the heavens are the place where God put the stars. So we know this now to be outer space. Heaven, singular, is more subjective in the Bible, but heavens, plural, are pretty clearly what we know to be outer space. And Isaiah says that God stretched these heavens out. Now this is somewhat figurative, since God is a spirit and does not have physical hands that he could stretch the heavens out with. However, I think that it is safe to say that the heavens consist of something that God's power could act on so as to stretch them. That is, if the heavens were completely empty as they appear, then God could not have stretched them. And this is consistent with what we know about space not being truly empty. It only appears that way. The discovery of dark energy in 1998 suggests that space is not empty, but rather is filled with dark energy that is responsible for the accelerating rate of the universe's expansion. And we know that space is filled with radiation and various forces from the celestial bodies. So, space is not empty as it appears. It is, in fact, something God could stretch out. One of the discoveries that helped pave the way for this discovery was Einstein's theory of relativity in 1905, in which he proposed a space-time fabric. Of course, all of this is well after the Psalms were written. This argument is stronger than it appears, for even if God is not actively stretching out outer space, but rather is, quote-unquote, stretching it out, what mechanism would one propose for this if not the expansion of the universe at the Big Bang? Either God is stretching out space directly, which aligns with what we know about dark matter, or he is doing it indirectly, which aligns with what we know about the expanding universe. Either way, David demonstrates remarkable knowledge of astronomy, given that he was writing this around 1000 BC. Isaiah 42:5 is corroborated by Psalm 104:2, which refers to God as covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. Allow me to answer some objections. One might say, well, what about the times that the Bible contradicts modern science? You're just cherry-picking the times that it does agree to build your case. And they might cite the parts of the Old Testament that are thought by some to contradict modern science, such as the creation account in Genesis, which seems to contradict the modern theory of Darwinian evolution. One could also bring up passages like Psalm 19 or Numbers 5 to build their case. Regardless of this, for some of the verses like Job 26:7, which says that the earth hangs on nothing, it really doesn't matter what's in the rest of the Bible. That verse stands on its own and can strongly evidence divine inspiration apart from the rest of the Bible. Of course, one would question the other parts of the Bible that aren't scientifically accurate, but that would not be a reason to discard Job. For the verses that aren't as strong, like the ones from the Levitical law that I used to build a cumulative case for inspiration, this objection is more serious. For my argument depended on there being a pattern in Scripture of positive health benefits or things that otherwise agree with modern science. If the objector provides a sufficient degree of examples that aren't that way, then it would appear that I am cherry-picking the parts that do agree, that it is nothing more than a coincidence. While such isolated advances would certainly be praiseworthy, as mentioned earlier, they would not evidence inspiration any more than the Greeks taking baths would. So what are these points? The big one that modern-day objectors will bring up is creation versus evolution. This was addressed earlier in the section on Genesis. Others might cite examples like Psalm 19, 5-6, which says that the sun runs a course like a runner running its race. And they would say, how can you believe in the Bible when it says the sun revolves around the earth? But I think it is clear when we read passages like this that the author is speaking figuratively, not literally. The way Psalm 19, 5-6 is written is very different from the passage in Psalm 104 I used earlier. Others might cite the example out of Numbers, which is the procedure used to determine the guilt of a woman who is accused of adultery by her husband. Basically, she was to go to the altar and drink some water that had dust from the altar floor mixed in it. And if she was guilty, the dust water would make her stomach swell and her thighs shrivel up. If she was innocent, then it would have no effect. And skeptics have accused this to being they've compared this to a trial by ordeal, similar to how they would toss witches into water, saying, well, if they float, then they are innocent, but if they sink, then they were guilty anyways. And a key difference here is that the Israelites had good reasons to believe that God was actually working through their procedure, whereas the prosecutors in the witch trials did not. For Israel had been miraculously delivered from Egypt not too long ago, not to mention the miraculous way in which they received the laws in Numbers. I am aware that the skeptic does not believe in the Bible, but that does not matter. All that matters is that, biblically speaking, the Israelites were acting on the basis of evidence, unlike the prosecutors in the witch trials, who oftentimes had questionable motives. Besides, it's not like Numbers was prescribing the drinking of dust water to everyone, saying, everyone drink dust water, it's good for your health. The drinking of it was for a special circumstance for which they had good reason to believe that God would indeed work through it. The next objection would say that the passages in the Bible I described were written at much later dates than I think. But was the Bible written in the 1900s? Because even if it were written in the 1800s, there would still be things in it, like tectonic plate theory and the genetic risks of inbreeding, that were not common knowledge until the 1900s. And that would still prove my point, for it would show that the biblical author still had scientific knowledge that was well ahead of their time. And if this trend continues into the future, then who knows how far ahead the skeptic will have to push the Bible's date of authorship in order to avoid its authority. If this seems obvious, know that secular scholars will often date the book of Daniel to somewhere between the 2nd and 5th centuries BC in order to place its authorship after the events that it claims to predict, such as the rise and fall of the kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But like our arguments here, that does not save them, for there are other prophecies about the coming of the Messiah in Daniel that weren't fulfilled until the time of Jesus. In fact, the exact day of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem is arguably predicted over 400 years in advance, something that shifting the date of authorship to the 2nd century BC does not solve. So I address this objection not because of its strength, but because of its popularity. As it is, this objection is likely to be ad hoc, meaning that it is made after the fact in order to justify a previously held belief. In academic circles, this is considered to be intellectually dishonest, for the objector is not following the evidence to the truth, rather they are crafting the truth based on their desires. Of course, not all who make this objection are guilty of this. I am only saying that it is generally the case. Heart issues aside, this objection suffers from a severe lack of evidence. To see this point defended in more detail, see my video on the historical reliability of the gospel accounts and my video on what Scripture says about itself. There is a reason why the Bible is dated the way it traditionally has been. In the following slides, I will summarize our findings, conclude, and give its implications. So let's start with the advancements in the Levitical law. On the far left-hand column, I have the Bible verse that is being studied. Moving our way to the right, I have the date in which this book was written. Next, we have the setting, meaning the time in which the event in it took place. Then we have the scientific knowledge that is contained within the verse. Lastly, I have the date in which this knowledge was confirmed through modern scientific discovery. And we can compare the 2nd and 5th columns to see how far ahead of its time the Bible was. And if we believe that the book of Job, for example, accurately records the sayings of Job, then the gap between what the Bible says and scientific discovery would increase. For then we would be comparing the third and the fifth columns. Starting with Genesis 9:4 and Leviticus 13:14 through 16, which were authored by Moses around 1440 BC, these tell the Israelites to not eat blood, which was not confirmed until germ theory was formalized in the 1860s. Verses like Leviticus 3:16 and Exodus 29:13 tell the Israelites to not eat fat, the health benefits of which were not confirmed until the 1900s. Chapters like Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11 tell the Israelites to not eat predators. The confirmation date for this is unknown, although it is not likely to be before the time of the Israelites. Leviticus 5:2, 13, and 15 say, in effect, to not spread germs by avoiding the carcass of unclean animals. This again was not confirmed until germ theory. Chapters like Leviticus 18 lay out sexual ethics that would prevent inbreeding, which was not confirmed until 1865 at the earliest, when genetics was founded by Gregor Mendel. Verses like Leviticus 12:3 command circumcision, the health benefits of which were not confirmed until the 1800s. Verses like Exodus 28:11 or 20 verses 8 through 11 command a Sabbath rest every week for Israel. The confirmation of this is unknown, although, as described, this knowledge was not intuitive to the Israelites as seen by their consistent violation of it. Verses like Deuteronomy 23:12 through 13 speak of sanitation through the burial of one's waste, and Leviticus 4:11 through 12 gives instructions for the disposal of waste, particularly the remains of an oxen. And Numbers 31:23 gives sterilization techniques. All of these were not confirmed until the 1860s through the development of germ theory. Again, none of these on their own are strong enough to prove divine inspiration. However, I do think that they present a strong cumulative case. Again, if one wishes to defeat my argument, all they have to do is find an ancient culture that predates Israel that has such a wide scope of practices that are consistent with modern scientific discovery, and a corresponding lack of practices that contradict scientific discovery. Besides the Levitical law, we had other scientific claims, which I believe are strong enough to stand on their own. Verses like Genesis 3:19, Psalm 104:29, and Ecclesiastes 3:20 collectively say that we both come from and return to dust. This was confirmed at the earliest in the 1860s when the periodic table was developed, showing that we are made of largely the same elements as dust. In verses like Genesis 7:11, Proverbs 3:20 and 8:28, and 2 Peter 3:5 through 6 speak of what I believe are subterranean oceans, which weren't discovered until the 1900s. Job 26 verse 7 says that the earth hangs on nothing, suggesting that it exists in something like outer space, which was not confirmed with certainty until the 1950s when space travel began. Verses like Job 26:10 and Proverbs 8:27 suggest that the earth is circular, which was something that wasn't considered until the Greeks until around 550 BC. Verses like Job 26 verse 8 and 36:27 through 28 speak of the water cycle. One could add Ecclesiastes 1:7, Psalm 104:3, and Isaiah 55:10 to this. Collectively, though, they display knowledge that corresponds with every major step of the water cycle, which was not formalized until the 1600s. Psalm 104:5 through 8 speaks of the creation in Genesis 1, demonstrating knowledge that is consistent with tectonic plate theory, underwater mountains, and the Earth's mantle. All of these waited until the 1900s to be confirmed scientifically. Isaiah 34:4 suggests that the sky is not empty like it appears to be. The confirmation date of this is unknown. Verses like Isaiah 40, verse 22, and 42:5 say the same thing of outer space, or the heavens, which was not confirmed until the discovery of dark energy in 1998. Again, the Israelites clearly did not understand the knowledge they possessed, nor did they use it to their own advantage, demonstrating that they were not the ultimate source of it. In this case, they must have received it from an outside source, of which God is the simplest and most reasonable explanation. I am aware that one could posit other explanations besides God, like advanced races of aliens, or maybe an incomplete knowledge on our part about the scientific advances of ancient cultures. To differentiate from these, I invoke Occam's razor, which says that when faced with competing explanations, that we should choose the simplest one with the fewest assumptions for our starting point. This is because introducing extra steps increases the potential for error, making it more likely to be wrong. So we stick with the simplest explanation until we have good reason to believe otherwise. This means that at face value, God is the source of the scientific knowledge contained in the Old Testament. So allow me to conclude and give some implications. In summary, we can trust certain parts of the Old Testament, namely the parts that demonstrate scientific knowledge well beyond its time, because these parts strongly evidence inspiration. Combine this with what I say in the beginning of my video titled, What Scripture Says About Itself, which is that the modern Bible that we have today must be treated as a unit. If one part is rejected, then the whole must also be rejected. This means that if one were to reject the parts of the Old Testament that do not show scientific knowledge, that they must also reject the parts that do. Since this would contradict what was defended here, one must accept the Old Testament in its entirety, or else poke a hole in my argument. This yields the conclusion that the Old Testament is God-breathed, and I will be supporting this through other arguments such as the historical reliability of the Old Testament, a series on fulfilled prophecies, and my video series on fulfilled types. And all of these can be seen earlier in my video series on the Defending the Bible. So allow me to conclude with a story about Matthew Fontaine Maury, who is considered the father of modern oceanography. He discovered ocean currents by reading Psalm 8:8, which says, "The birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas." And that led him to search for these paths of the seas that David mentions. The result was the modern field of oceanography. Of course, when he attributed his discovery to a religious text, he was attacked by the naturalists of the day, despite the fact that he used an ancient text to discover something that modern science to that day was ignorant of. But Fontaine responded to these accusations in a speech in 1860. I think it sums up pretty well what we have covered, so here it is. He says, "I have been blamed by men of science, both in this country and in England, for quoting the Bible in confirmation of the doctrines of physical geography. The Bible, they say, was not written for scientific purposes, and is therefore of no authority in matters of science. I beg pardon. The Bible is authority for everything it touches. What would you think of the historian who should refuse to consult the historical records of the Bible, because the Bible was not written for the purposes of history? The Bible is true and science is true, and therefore each, if truly read, but proves the truth of the other." So that is everything. In the next video, we will transition back to the New Testament and defend the authority of the apostolic writings, which refer to the New Testament books that are written by the apostles of Jesus. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you there.